What if the most advanced civilization that ever existed was not destroyed by an outside force, but by itself? What if the flood was not the beginning of the tragedy, but the final result of a collapse that took generations to complete? Because before the waters came, before the sky cracked open and the earth gave way, there was a world functioning, building, advancing. A world that had reached a level of sophistication that most people never imagine when they think of this story. And it was precisely that world, intelligent, organized, and powerful, that destroyed itself from within. What happened next changed everything. But there is something about this story that almost no one discusses, something the original Hebrew texts recorded with disturbing precision, something that disappears completely in the simplified versions that have reached most of us. It is not about the ark, it is not about the animals, it is about the conditions, the specific, detailed, documented conditions that made the flood not just possible, but inevitable. And when you understand those conditions with real depth, you will realize something that will leave you in silence. They do not belong only to the past. The biblical mysteries surrounding this narrative go much deeper than anything most of us were ever taught. The original Hebrew texts describe a civilization that was not primitive, it was sophisticated, capable, and corrupted from the inside out. A society that had reached extraordinary levels of organization and knowledge, yet had completely abandoned any moral foundation. Modern naval engineers who analyzed the ark's specifications recorded in these ancient texts the proportions, the dimensions, the precise relationship between length, width, and height, discovered something they did not expect to find. Someone or something knew exactly what they were doing. And that detail alone changes the entire nature of this story. But it is only the beginning of what is hidden here. The hidden truths preserved in this narrative carry a weight that goes far beyond conventional religion or history. They carry a warning, the kind of warning that only makes sense when you stop reading this story as an ancient tale and start reading it as a precise diagnosis of what happens when a civilization loses its foundations. The signs of the times are written in these pages with a clarity that stops anyone willing to look closely. In this documentary, we will examine what the world truly was before the flood, what brought the Creator to a decision that, according to the text itself, made him grieve before he acted, and what the rainbow in the sky truly means when you read the original Hebrew word. What you are about to find here is not what you were told, and it will never look like the same story again. Most people think they know the story of Noah. A man, a boat, a flood. Animals 2 by 2. It sounds almost like a children's tale. Simple, familiar, safe. Something you heard once in a Sunday school class and filed away under things I already know. But what if everything you were taught only scratched the surface? What if the real story, the one buried beneath centuries of tradition and comfortable retelling, is far darker, far more precise, and far more relevant to the world you're living in right now? Because before the waters came, before the sky cracked open and the earth gave way beneath the weight of what was falling, there was a civilization. Not a primitive one, not a scattered collection of wandering tribes, a civilization that had been building, organizing, and advancing for generations. And what that civilization did, and what it forgot, cost it everything. This is not a story about a flood. This is a story about the conditions that made the flood the only remaining option. The ancient Hebrew text describes the pre-flood world with a single word that carries enormous weight: shaketh. It is almost always translated simply as corrupt, but that translation loses something essential. Shaketh doesn't mean bad in the casual way we use that word today. It means ruined from the inside out, destroyed at the foundation, like a structure that looks solid from the street but has had its core eaten away so completely that the next strong wind will bring the whole thing down. The text doesn't say the earth was touched by corruption, or influenced by it, or struggling against it. It says the earth was filled with it. Every layer, every culture, every corner of the known world. And alongside that corruption, the text places one more word: violence. Not isolated violence, not the violence of a few dangerous individuals, systemic, pervasive, normalized violence, the kind that stops shocking people because it has simply become the landscape they live in. But there is something rarely discussed in any conventional teaching about this era, something that changes the entire picture. The text doesn't only blame the people, it describes the earth itself as corrupt, as if the moral state of humanity had somehow infected the very ground beneath their feet. Ancient Jewish interpreters, particularly those writing in the tradition of the Midrash, suggested that the corruption had become so total that even the natural order was beginning to break down. The boundaries established at creation, between kinds, between species, between the sacred and the common, were being erased, one by one, generation by generation. Animals were crossing lines nature hadn't designed them to cross. Roles were dissolving. The architecture of the created order was being dismantled from within. And with each boundary that fell, something irreplaceable was lost. This is one of the hidden truths that rarely makes it into the conversation. The flood was not just a response to human wickedness, it was a response to a world that had systematically unraveled itself. What made this civilization so dangerous wasn't just its evil, it was its intelligence. This is the detail that changes everything. Ancient texts, including fragments from the Book of Enoch, a work deeply respected by early Jewish scholars and directly referenced in the New Testament, described the pre-flood world as one of remarkable sophistication. Cities, structures, systems of knowledge. But knowledge in the hands of people who have abandoned all moral framework doesn't simply become neutral. It becomes a weapon. It becomes efficient destruction. The pre-flood civilization wasn't a gathering of wandering savages making impulsive choices. It was an organized, capable, advancing society that had turned its considerable gifts towards ruin. And that combination, high capacity paired with total moral collapse, is precisely what made the situation, in the language of the ancient text, irredeemable. Sound familiar? It should, because that pattern has a pattern, and patterns repeat. There is a thread in this story that modern readers almost always miss. The narrative tells us that the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took them, any they chose, without limitation, without consequence. For centuries, theologians have debated exactly what this passage means. Some argue these were fallen spiritual beings crossing into the physical world. Others suggest they were powerful human rulers, men who had claimed divine status and who operated above any law. But here is what almost every serious interpretation agrees on. There was a merging of boundaries that should never have been crossed, a deliberate, systematic blurring of lines that had been established at the foundation of the created order. And the offspring of this union, the Nephilim, are described as mighty men of old, men of renown, famous, powerful, celebrated. And yet part of what broke the world, because greatness without moral grounding is not greatness at all. It is just destruction wearing a crown, and a world that celebrates it is a world already in free fall. Consider for a moment what it must have felt like to live inside that world. If you were someone who still held on to something true, someone who hadn't fully surrendered to the current of the surrounding culture, you would have been isolated, surrounded, perhaps mocked. The text describes Noah as righteous in his generation, which sounds straightforward until you understand what his generation actually looked like. Righteous in that context doesn't mean sinless. It doesn't mean perfect. It means oriented, still facing the right direction in a world where everyone else had turned away, still listening in a world that had gone completely deaf. Ancient rabbinical commentators point out something striking here. Noah spent what some traditions estimate as 100 years building the ark, in plain sight, in public, where anyone could see. Some of those same commentators suggest this was not accidental, that the construction itself was a message, a visible, undeniable, years-long invitation to pay attention, to reconsider, to return. The world before the flood was not destroyed because God lost patience with a handful of bad people on a bad day. It was destroyed because the entire architecture of human civilization, value by value, boundary by boundary, relationship by relationship, had been so thoroughly dismantled that there was nothing left to rebuild from. And here is the detail that the biblical account wants you to sit with, the one that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The being who made this decision did not make it from a cold distance. The text says he grieved, deeply, personally, that the decision wounded him before it was carried out. A God described throughout the ancient scriptures as all-knowing looked at what humanity had become and felt something that the text can only describe as heartbreak. That detail does not make the flood easier to understand, but it makes it impossible to misread. This was not the act of an indifferent force. This was the last act of a creator watching his creation consume itself and grieving before he acted. And that changes everything about what comes next. But what God felt in that moment has almost never been told the way the ancient text actually describes it. And when you understand it, the entire story shifts. There is a verse buried in the 6th chapter of Genesis that most people read in 3 seconds and move past without stopping. It doesn't have the visual drama of the floodwaters. It doesn't have the scale of the ark. It is quiet, almost whispered, and precisely because it is quiet, it tends to disappear inside the larger spectacle of the story surrounding it. The verse says, "The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." Stop there. Read it again. The creator of the universe, the being described throughout the ancient scriptures as eternal, all-knowing, beyond time and limitation, is described here as experiencing something that can only be called grief. Not frustration, not administrative disappointment, grief. The kind that doesn't sit on the surface, the kind that settles into the chest and changes how you breathe. This is one of the most staggering hidden truths in all of ancient literature, and it is almost never given the weight it deserves. God did not send the flood in cold fury. He sent it in grief. The Hebrew word used to describe God's inner state in this passage is yitatsev, a term that carries the meaning of being pained in one's innermost being, wounded at the core. It shares a root with the word used elsewhere to describe the pain of labor, the anguish of deep loss, the kind of sorrow that does not pass quickly. This is not a metaphor the ancient writers chose carelessly. They could have written that God was angry. They could have written that he was displeased. They chose a word that means he was wounded. And that choice is deliberate, because a being who is wounded by human choices is a being who is genuinely, personally invested in those choices, who is not watching from a cold distance behind a veil of omnipotence, unmoved and untouched, but who is, in whatever mysterious way a divine being experiences reality, intimately connected to what is unfolding on earth. The flood in this reading is not an act of cosmic bureaucracy. It is an act of anguished love. What does it mean for an all-knowing God to grieve? This is the question that has occupied the greatest theological minds across Jewish and Christian traditions for thousands of years. If he knew what would happen, and the theological tradition consistently affirms that he did, why does the text describe something that sounds so much like surprise, like disappointment, like a parent who watched their child walk toward a cliff, who called out warning after warning, who could see the outcome long before it arrived, and who felt the weight of every refusal to turn back anyway? Some of the most brilliant interpreters of this passage have wrestled with exactly this tension, and almost universally they arrive at a similar conclusion. The grief is real. It is not a literary device. It is not anthropomorphic decoration added to make the story more readable. The text is insisting that we understand something specific about the nature of the Creator, and it is insisting with a word that means wounded. Not annoyed, not offended, wounded. But here is where the story introduces a detail that shifts the entire emotional landscape. Immediately after describing God's grief, immediately after recording that his heart was deeply troubled, the text pivots with one of the most important words in the entire narrative. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. That word favor is doing enormous work in this sentence. It doesn't mean Noah was sinless. Ancient commentators across multiple traditions are consistent on this point. Noah was not a perfect man. Favor in the ancient understanding was relational. It described a connection that had not been severed, a thread of faithfulness, imperfect perhaps, fragile, that still ran between this one man and his Creator. In a world that had broken the heart of God, Noah was the one person who was still listening, still oriented, still holding the thread. And sometimes, in the economy of the ancient narrative, that is enough.
Some biblical scholars have noted something subtle and profoundly important about how Noah's righteousness is described. It is never described in absolute terms. It is always described as relative, righteous in his generation, not righteous in some ideal, unattainable sense. Righteous in the context of the most morally collapsed civilization in human history. This nuance matters more than most people realize. It removes the story from the realm of myth and places it squarely in human experience. Noah wasn't chosen because he had achieved some impossible standard of perfection. He was chosen because in a world that had stopped listening entirely, he still could. In a world where the divine signal had been drowned out by centuries of noise and corruption, there was one man whose inner receivers still worked. And that, not sinlessness, not superhuman virtue, was what made him the one through whom the story could continue. Many ancient rabbinical commentators noted something about the timeline of this narrative that is almost never discussed in modern settings. Noah didn't build the ark in secret. He built it over what some traditions estimate as a century, in the open, in public, visible to everyone around him. And those same commentators suggest this was not incidental, that the ark, during its construction, was itself functioning as a warning, as an invitation, as a physical, undeniable, years-long sign that something was coming and that there was still time to respond differently. Every day that Noah worked, cutting timber, fitting beams, sealing walls with pitch, was another day the invitation remained open. Another day the door had not yet closed. The grief of God in this reading was not the grief of someone who acted too quickly. It was the grief of someone who waited longer than anyone could have expected and watched every single invitation go unanswered. Here is the detail that should stop us completely. The being who sent the flood did not do so without cost. The text will not allow us to read it that way. It insists, quietly, almost in a whisper, that something in the divine heart broke when the decision was made, and that this breaking was considered important enough to record, important enough to preserve across thousands of transmission and translation. Why? Because the ancient writers understood something we often forget. The most important thing to know about any act of judgment is not its severity. It is the character of the one who renders it. And the character revealed in this passage is not cold fury. It is wounded love. Love that had extended invitation after invitation across generations. Love that had been refused so completely for so long that the world had to be reset. And even in that resetting, even as the decision was being made, it grieved. That is the God of the flood narrative, not a destroyer, a grieving creator who had run out of any other option. But what Noah actually built is something that modern engineers have studied with genuine astonishment. And what they found in those ancient measurements was not what anyone expected.
When most people picture Noah's Ark, they imagine something between a children's toy and a Hollywood prop. Wide, rounded, slightly cartoonish, with a giraffe's neck poking cheerfully out the top. Something charming, something simple, something that belongs on a nursery wall. But the actual specifications recorded in the ancient text tell a completely different story. According to Genesis 6:15, the ark was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Convert those measurements into modern terms and the numbers become striking. Approximately 135 meters long, 22.5 meters wide, and 13.5 meters tall. To put that in physical terms, the length of 1.5 football fields and the height of a 4-story building. This was not a boat. This was an engineering undertaking of almost incomprehensible scale for its era. And what naval architects discovered when they studied those proportions centuries later with the full benefit of modern science was something they did not expect to find. Naval engineers who have analyzed the specifications recorded in the biblical text have noted something that stops the conversation cold. The ratio of length to width to height described in Genesis, the precise relationship between those 3 dimensions, is remarkably close to the optimal ratio for a large vessel designed to survive open ocean storm conditions. The 6-to-1 ratio between length and width in particular is considered by modern shipbuilders to be nearly ideal for maximizing both internal volume and hydrodynamic stability in severe sea states. It produces a low center of gravity that dramatically reduces the risk of capsizing. It distributes the stresses caused by large waves more effectively than almost any other configuration. In other words, whoever provided those specifications knew exactly what they were doing, not approximately, not adequately, with a precision that would not be independently arrived at by modern naval science for thousands of years. The original Hebrew word used for the ark is tevah, and this single detail contains one of the most overlooked hidden truths in the entire narrative. Tevah is not the standard Hebrew word for a ship. It is not the word used for boats, vessels, or seafaring craft anywhere else in the scriptures. In the entire Hebrew Bible, tevah appears exactly twice, once for Noah's Ark and once for the reed basket in which the infant Moses was placed in the waters of the Nile. Both times, it describes something with a specific and deliberate characteristic. It is not steered by its occupant. There is no mention of a rudder in the ark, no sail, no navigation mechanism of any kind. Noah did not sail the ark. He did not captain it or guide it. He built it, entered it, and entrusted the outcome entirely to forces beyond his own ability to manage. The word tevah is not just a label for a structure. It is a theological statement about the posture of the person inside it. The internal structure of the ark reveals a level of engineering sophistication that continues to generate serious academic discussion. The text describes 3 decks, 3 distinct floors, which structural engineers note would have created a system of horizontal diaphragms, dramatically increasing the vessel's rigidity. Transverse and longitudinal beams forming a cellular framework similar in principle to techniques used in modern shipbuilding. This configuration would have distributed the structural stresses caused by massive wave impacts across the entire vessel, rather than concentrating them at any single point. The exterior was treated with pitch, gopher in Hebrew, applied both inside and out. This bituminous substance served not only as waterproofing, but, according to materials scientists who have studied ancient shipbuilding, would have increased the flexibility of the wooden structure, allowing it to absorb impact rather than fracture under it. Every element of the design was doing precisely what it needed to do. But there is something about the ark that goes far beyond its physical engineering. Scholars in the tradition of typological interpretation, reading the ancient texts as containing layered meanings beneath the historical surface, have long observed that the ark functions as more than a historical vessel. It functions as a model, a prototype, and what it models is a specific idea, a prepared space in the middle of total chaos, a structure built not to avoid the storm, but to survive it. The ark did not go around the flood, it went through it. Every person and creature inside survived not by being sheltered from the crisis, but by being carried through the full weight of it. This pattern, preparation, endurance, emergence, appears throughout the entire arc of the biblical narrative in ways that are impossible to dismiss as coincidence. And it begins here with a man who built something that looked absurd to everyone watching in response to a word he had chosen to believe.
Then came a moment that the text records with quiet precision and that most readers pass over without fully absorbing. After Noah and his family had entered the ark, after all the animals had come and been settled, after every provision had been stored, the text says that God shut the door. Not Noah,
not his sons. The door was closed from the outside by the hand of the Creator. And then, nothing happened. No rain, no flood. 7 days of complete silence. 7 days inside a sealed vessel, with the world still going about its business outside. What must that have felt like? 7 days of waiting, listening, perhaps hearing the sounds of daily life continuing on the other side of a sealed door. Ancient Jewish tradition identifies those 7 days as a period of divine mourning, God grieving the world that was about to be lost. Even in the final moments before the storm, there was sorrow. And inside the ark, there was nothing to do but wait and trust and stay. The ark survived what no human engineering of that era should have been able to survive. It rode out a catastrophe of global proportions, weeks of continuous storm conditions, structural stresses that would have destroyed any vessel not specifically designed to endure them, and it held. When the waters finally began to recede, the text records that the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, a high place above the waterline. The journey had been long and the conditions beyond anything those 8 people had ever experienced, but the structure held because it had been built correctly. Not impressively, not beautifully, not in a way that earned the admiration of the people who watched it being constructed. Correctly, in precise response to precise instruction. And that is the deepest statement the ark makes, not as a historical object, but as a pattern. What is built in faithful response to trustworthy instruction will survive what nothing built for any other reason can. But what came after the flood contains a promise that most people only know half of, and the half they don't know is the part that was meant for right now. When the waters receded and Noah stepped out onto dry ground for the first time in over a year, something happened that the text records as one of the most significant moments in all of human history. God established a covenant, not just with Noah, not just with his family, but with every living creature on earth, and with the earth itself. And the sign of that covenant was something placed in the sky, a rainbow. Today, the rainbow has been claimed by many movements, many meanings, many cultural conversations. But before all of that, thousands of years before any of it, it was placed in the sky with a specific intention, carrying a specific message. And that message, when you read it in the original language, is not quite what most people assume it is, because the rainbow in the ancient text is not simply a symbol of peace. It is a signature on a contract, and like every contract, it has 2 sides. The Hebrew word for rainbow in this passage is keshet, and here is the detail that almost no one discusses. Keshet is also the standard Hebrew word for a warrior's bow, a weapon, not a decorative arc of light, a weapon of war. And this has led some of the most careful readers of the ancient text across centuries of Jewish interpretation to suggest something that changes the entire meaning of the image. When God placed the keshet in the sky, he was not simply drawing a colorful symbol of hope, he was positioning a bow. And the bow was aimed not at the earth, but away from it, upward toward the heavens, as if the Creator, in the act of establishing the covenant, was laying down his weapon, turning the instrument of judgment away from humanity, deliberately, permanently. The rainbow in this reading is not a decoration. It is a portrait of chosen restraint, of power deliberately withheld, of a decision to engage differently, not because the situation had changed, but because a promise had been made. But the covenant contains something that is almost never preached, almost never discussed in any casual retelling of the flood story. Alongside the promise of never again will the waters cover the entire earth to destroy all life, there is an acknowledgement embedded in the very structure of the text that the problem the flood addressed was not fully resolved. Because Noah and his family stepped off the ark carrying the same human nature that had gone into it. And within a remarkably short time after the flood, the story of human moral failure continues. The same seeds are present, the same tendencies. The ancient text doesn't hide this. It doesn't pretend the flood produced a new kind of humanity. What changed was not humanity. What changed was God's chosen response to an unchanged humanity.
The rainbow is not a sign that the world became better after the flood. It is a sign that God chose to stay in it anyway. This is where the hidden truth of the covenant rainbow becomes profoundly personal. Because if the Creator looked at a post-flood world still carrying the full weight of human moral failure, knowing the history that would follow, knowing every war, every genocide, every act of systematic cruelty that would unfold across the centuries, and still made the promise, then the covenant is unconditional. It does not hold because humanity earned it. It holds because it was made, and that is theologically and existentially enormous. It means the rainbow, every time it appears in the sky after rain, is not a reward. It is not a grade on a report card. It is a reminder of an unconditional commitment made by a being who knew exactly, with full foreknowledge, what he was committing to. He saw all of it before he put the bow in the sky, and he put it there anyway.
And yet, and this is the part that does not get nearly enough attention, the covenant is not without its warning, because the very existence of the flood in the permanent memory of humanity functions as evidence. Evidence that the conditions which produced the flood are conditions the Creator takes with absolute seriousness. The promise is specific. The global flood will not be repeated. But the text does not promise that judgment itself has been retired. Other ancient writings, portions of the prophetic literature, texts from what Christians call the New Testament, make explicit that the warning embedded in the flood narrative remains fully active, that the pattern it describes is not a one-time anomaly in history, but a recurring signature of how the story works. The mechanism changes, the pattern does not. Jesus of Nazareth, whose teachings are preserved in the New Testament, made a direct and deliberate reference to the days of Noah. He said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." He was not making a casual historical comparison. He was identifying the flood narrative as a template, a pattern that would find its echo in a future moment. And the details he chose to highlight are deeply revealing. He did not focus on the wickedness of that generation. He focused on the normalcy. People eating and drinking, people marrying and building and going about their daily lives, not noticing, not paying attention, not reading what was written clearly in the conditions around them. The warning Jesus drew from Noah's days was not primarily about the presence of evil. It was about the blindness, about the human capacity to be completely surrounded by signs and see nothing at all. So the Rainbow Covenant holds two messages simultaneously, and they must be held together, because separating them loses the full weight of what the ancient text is communicating. The first message is mercy. The specific catastrophe of a global flood will not be repeated. The promise stands and has stood for thousands of years. The second message is memory. This happened. These conditions existed. This response was required. And the memory is not preserved to create paralyzing fear. It is preserved to create awareness, to keep alive the understanding that certain patterns, when they reach a certain threshold, carry consequences that cannot be negotiated away. The world Noah lived in did not end because it was irredeemably wicked. It ended because it stopped paying attention. And the question the ancient text leaves open for every generation that has read it since is not whether it could happen again. The question is whether we are paying attention now. We began in a world that had forgotten itself, a civilization of extraordinary capacity that had turned its gifts toward the systematic dismantling of everything that held it together. We followed one man, imperfect, isolated, faithful, who heard something no one around him believed and built something the world called absurd. We sat with the grief of a creator who did not act in cold fury, but in wounded love, who waited far longer than anyone expected, and who felt the weight of every invitation that went unanswered. We stood inside an ark built to specifications that stunned modern engineers, a vessel with no rudder, no sail, no navigation system, guided entirely by something beyond human control. And we read a rainbow not as a simple symbol of hope, but as a warrior's bow turned away from the earth, chosen restraint, unconditional promise, and active warning, all held in a single image in the sky. And now we are here, in our own moment, with our own questions. What does a world look like when the lines that hold it together are erased one by one? What does it feel like to be building something in faithful response to a word that the culture around you considers irrelevant? What does it mean that the man who survived was not the most powerful, not the most intelligent, not the most celebrated, but the one who was still listening when everyone else had gone silent? The flood narrative has survived thousands of years not because it is a comfortable story. It has survived because it is one of the most precise and unflinching portraits ever written of the relationship between human choice and ultimate consequence, between the slow erosion of moral foundations and the moment when erosion becomes collapse. The warning is not hidden in encrypted prophecy. The signs of the times are not buried where only scholars can find them. They are in the patterns, in the headlines, in the gradual normalization of things that once shocked, in the slow, quiet disappearance of lines that once seemed permanent. Noah didn't know the exact day the rain would begin. He knew the word he had been given was trustworthy. So he built, and he waited. And when the door closed, and it was not his hand that closed it, he stayed inside and trusted what he could not see over what he could. The ancient story does not end with a flood. It ends with a question left open for every generation that comes after. What are you building? And are you still listening? Drop the word scrolls in the comments to let us know you're watching, and subscribe to the Hidden Scrolls for more hidden truths buried in the pages the world forgot to read.